Good evening, and thank you so much for joining Compassion in World Farming's webinar this evening, where we'll be exploring how we're working with leading food companies to create change at scale. I'm Philip Lymbery, the Global Chief Executive for Compassion in World Farming, and your host for this evening. I'll be introducing our speakers this evening, Dr. Tracey Jones, who heads up Compassion's food business engagement work, and Nicky Amos, the Executive Director of the Business Benchmark on Farm Animal Welfare. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit of background to our corporate engagement work and how we're working with companies. And it's work which started out of a desire, actually a passion, to help as many animals as possible in the most cost-effective way, to reduce suffering on a huge scale. It's a program that was originally born out of a need to win corporate support for a ban on barren battery cages, mainly by getting companies to sign up to taking battery eggs off their shelves for good, whole swathes of cruelty, thereby demonstrating that it could be done, that it was commercially viable, perfectly practical, in fact, the right thing to do. This was all with a view to getting the European Union to hold firm on its intended ban on barren battery cages, that most awful icon of factory farming, which frustratingly had a piece of legislation with a review moment built in midway before implementation. But we didn't just hold our breath and wait, we garnered corporate support. Well, we got plenty of companies on board. And the good news is that as well as those companies coming on board, the ban went ahead in 2012. And in those moments, for us, a way of working was born, of engaging with companies positively to make sweeping commitments to improve the lives of animals. It was a real game changer. Instead of protesting outside stores, which was great fun, which made us feel good, but actually changed nothing, we would instead ring them up and have a very different conversation. Hey, do you want to do something that will be great for your company, will go down well with your customers and will stop animal suffering too? Oh, and you could also win an award. Well, who could resist such a conversation? We changed the conversation. Our strategy was to engage and encourage a conversation about change and to celebrate it. We turned name and shame on its head to become name and fame, to make wholesale pledges to remove cage eggs or crate produced pork or mega dairy milk from all the shelves that the company owned, all the products that they sold. We offered awards. We started off with the Good Egg Award. Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Then we went on to Good Chicken and Good Pig, even the Good Rabbit Award for giving animals decent lives without cages. The celebrations got bigger and more prestigious every year. What started out as a fringe meeting in the House of Commons grew into much bigger events with celebrity hosts in fantastic places like St. Paul's Cathedral and the Eiffel Tower. Companies doing good things for animals, making sweeping pledges on eggs, on chicken, on dairy, turning the tide of change. We took this way of working across the EU and into the US, where we pioneered the Better Chicken Initiative, getting major companies to commit to higher welfare chicken as standard. It sparked off a domino effect where 100 companies or more signed up to what previously seemed like an unimaginably ambitious program. We took our program into Africa, signing up leading companies like Woolworths in South Africa. We went into China too, where we met some of the most enthusiastic companies to join the change to a more compassionate world. It led to very different outcomes, measurable impact for animals on a scale we'd simply not seen before. Since those early days and that fringe meeting in the House of Commons, our food business engagement program has gone on to work with more than 1,000 companies. Those companies have made game-changing commitments to improve the lives of many millions of animals. In fact, the total number of animals now set to benefit every year from this program stands at over 2 billion. Yes, 2 billion animals every year. If they were all chickens, which they're not, but bear with me for a moment, if they were all chickens standing wing to wing, they would span the earth 400 times. As well as this pioneering work, engaging with companies positively, we'll also be hearing tonight about another pioneering strategy, now in its 9th year, to engage the investor community by producing an annual league table, now ranking 150 leading food companies around the world on how they're doing on farmed animal welfare. It's a business benchmark on farm animal welfare, and it's supported by a dedicated consortium of investors with over 2 trillion worth of assets under management. We have garnered the big guns to drive change for animals. Before we hear more about the business benchmark, let me introduce you to the person who leads that positive engagement that I was talking about, our food business engagement program globally. With 18 years applied animal welfare and behaviour research at Oxford University, backed by degrees in animal science and production, and now 10 years of experience in working with food companies to create major change for animals, it's my pleasure to introduce our Global Director of Food Business Engagement, Dr. Tracey Jones. Tracey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. It's always a pleasure to speak to our donors and supporters about the Food Business Programme. And I'm here to talk to you today about how the programme raises baseline standards and is about to rebalance the protein that our companies offer to their customers. Philip, can you see my slides?
Yeah, looking good.
Excellent. Technology is working. That's always the heart moment when it goes. So here we are, raising baseline standards for animals throughout the global food supply chain of our leading companies. With a positive engagement approach, as Philip has said, we're in the room talking to companies, in the boardrooms, even talking to CEOs and their CSR teams, their marketing teams, and their agriculture teams. And we focus on driving commitments, getting companies to say yes, they will do good things for animals and higher welfare. Great. But we also want them to comply to that, to make sure that the animals on the ground do end up in those higher welfare systems. So we have a lot of tools around compliance, and increasingly we help companies implement those changes. They can't do it alone very often. Our credentials are high. We have over 10 years experience of running the food business work. We operate in 3 regions, as Philip said, Europe, the US, China, and increasing now going into Asia. We have 5 key tools, which we'll talk about in this evening's session. And we do have 6 species awards, 5 category awards, more than 1,100 award winners, and at this moment in time, at any one time, we're in high or medium engagement with around 96 companies across 6 food business managers. We have 29 staff in total, and about a third of those are in transition at the minute with replacements, new staff, and even maternity covers. And Philip always steals my thunder around the 2 billion animals set to benefit, which we're very proud of. So, commitments. You will know about our awards programme. They've been operating for many years. Started life with the Good Egg Award 13 years ago, and I'm pleased to say they are still driving change. Why is it important to award companies? Well, they do need that public recognition. They want to improve their brand loyalty. They want a competitive advantage, and it's actually to our advantage that companies do have a competitive nature, because it drives change. We can't get to every company, but the market can do that work with us through the competitive nature. Prestigious awards events are very nice, and they do help and encourage companies to, participate in our awards. I was very disappointed this year that we had to cancel our award ceremony, although we still awarded companies, because we were set to host it at the Tower of London. What better prestigious place in the UK than that? We also drive commitments outside the awards programme, and this is very much seen around cage-free eggs and better chicken, or higher welfare chicken for broiler chickens, as Philip mentioned. And I'm really, really proud to say that, this is based on NGO movement, but compassion was the heart of building that movement and driving that movement forwards. In 2016, our executive director in the US went into a high-level meeting with McDonald's and persuaded them that they were not going to take enriched cages and just stop barren cages. They were going to move to cage-free. It was a massive meeting, a massive turn of tide, because after that announcement, there was a complete ripple across the industry that led to most companies now having a cage-free commitment on laying hens, and seeing that momentum come across into Europe with our work with Tesco and other leading companies as well. We were also instrumental in the changes around broiler chickens, and this is a very live, ongoing NGO movement at the moment. We worked for several years with the Knorr team, a Unilever, Bouillon, who would even think that, meat is really in those products. And in 2016, they committed to global high welfare chicken standards for their bouillon, also their pig meat and their beef as well. Phenomenal commitment, and it was driven by the sustainability team, and it was driven by wanting to do the right thing. Again, our executive director in the US at the time developed a coalition of NGOs, 8 NGOs, that drove changes throughout companies in the US. We followed suit in the EU, and to date we have more than 200 companies signing up to the Better Chicken Commitment in the US, more than 120 companies in Europe, and that's with leading NGOs, 8 NGOs in the US and 23 NGOs in Europe on that movement. And that's brilliant. Compassion itself has been instrumental, I think, in 30 of those changes, and they are big names like KFC, like Subway, like M&S, Waitrose, Casino, Danone. So we're really proud of that movement, but we know that, it doesn't make a difference to animals unless there's change. So our compliance work consists of various tools. The supermarket survey, actually Philip, on his first foray with Compassion many years ago, developed this as a public ranking. We then took it on, developed it into a confidential, a deep dive analysis consultancy tool with retailers, and provides a really in-depth gap analysis in their animal welfare standards, what they can do by species to help solve various problems. We get companies ultimately on awards out of this, and long-term change as well, driving change for broiler chickens and different broiler breeds. We've built it up from 5 companies originally to 2015, there were 7 companies involved. 2017, there were 15 companies, and in our last iteration, there were 28 companies involved in this. So highly valued tool with more than 165 meaningful recommendations for animals, either fully or partially completed by our participants. So confidential to public facing, and I know Nicky is going to talk to you about the business benchmark for animal welfare. We use this tool hugely in the food business team. It allows us to engage with food companies at all stages of their journey. Prior to that, it was really hard to legitimately talk to companies that didn't have a meaningful animal welfare policy. We went straight in with awards and higher requirements. BB4 actually allows us to talk to companies that don't have animal welfare policies, all the way through to those that are now reporting on performance and improving their performance on animal welfare. And I'm pleased to say that of the 88 companies that have improved their tier ranking over the years, we have engaged meaningfully with 59 of those companies, some on and off as they come in and out, depending on their focus. But really, really proud that this tool is really a door opener for us and driving change. The other tool that I'd like to talk about is EggTrack. And this was born out of a really, really simple idea when McDonald's first made that huge market shift towards cage-free commitments in the US. Every week, I remember there was another commitment, another commitment, another commitment. We were cheering from the rafters. And, you know, I just said, we have to make sure that these companies comply with this. And we drew out a very simple way in which we could track these global commitments and the way that we could then report publicly on that. And I'm pleased to say that this year, after several years of EggTrack in the US and the EU, we've taken the tracker globally. We are now tracking 211 leading companies on their transition to cage-free. 78 of them are global companies. 57 are based predominantly in the US and 76 predominantly in the EU. Of the 25 companies that have global commitments, one has already completed that commitment at a global level. We have improved reporting. Up to 50% of companies are reporting now in the US, and from 70 to 77% are now reporting in the EU. And it's actually a really complicated tool to report on because of the various ways that companies actually make their commitments and then report on them. But just to give you an indication, we are tracking 281 commitments across 101 companies that are in Europe as part of this tracker, and obviously more complicated on the US side as well. So, as I said, commitments, compliance, and implementation. And we're finding increasingly that companies are coming to us and saying, look, help, you know, we know what we have to do, we know why we have to do it, we just don't know how. Can you help us? And we've been building a portfolio of work around the multi-species that involves multi-stakeholder forums where we come together, we discuss not only the why, but more about the how. How can we resolve some of the key barriers and drive key solutions? How can we do this collectively? And we also then have sub-working groups that are led by industry to help solve certain issues. And if we take the Better Chicken commitment, you know, what's the visual ID? How can we communicate this to our consumer? What's the critical pathway? What are the major stumbling blocks? How can we get breed change? And how can we marry animal welfare and sustainability? And we have leading companies driving those working groups with us, which is great. It's a very collective action. We also look at, you know, the roles of those multi-stakeholders, and we help build companies with their roadmap for change, whether it's making the case internally, helping them analyze their supply chain, helping them with supply chain solutions and demonstrating best practice, or helping speak to their consumers. And an example where this has worked really well recently is on cage-free movement in the UK. So we have a lot of companies. We reckon we can get to 85% cage-free with the company commitments that we have already. And there was a big stumbling block about what would good look like in terms of a barn, particularly. barn systems, free-range systems, organic systems. And we worked with Noble Foods, one of the key leading producers in the UK, with Tesco and with the British poultry producers through their Egg Council to map out what the standard for barn would look like. And we did this because the legislation, EU and UK legislation, would have permitted highly intensive systems which would have done, frankly, technical term, diddly squat for animal welfare, absolutely nothing. So intensive that what was the point of, converting to these systems? The industry had already converted to enriched cages and found them obsolete well before the lifetime of them. So they were keen not to repeat that mistake again. So they wanted our help in saying what is going to be fit for purpose, what will deliver animal welfare benefits to the laying hens, and what is going to be fit for future, i.e. worth them investing in. And so we developed a standard with BIC, Noble and Tesco that gave the birds much more space, gave them much better ability to walk through the system, up and down the multi-tiers, secluded nest boxes, good perching spaces. And I have to say, I think it was just the back end of last year, Noble Foods converted one of their big houses. We have it on video case study if you want to look. And I actually did feel very proud of what we had achieved when I saw hens dust bathing, foraging, perching, moving around, wing flapping, jumping. It was an absolute pleasure to watch, and one that I thought that might not happen in just barn systems. And we also stopped some of the most intensive systems coming into the UK. These are called combination systems. Shut the doors, they're an enriched cage, and they were being marketed, well, in the US particularly, as being fine to convert into, because when the NGOs go away, just convert back to cages. And we said, no way, that is not going to happen. So we stopped that in the UK, and we're fighting that in Italy and Spain at the moment, and looking at ways in which producers can convert out of those. Our work is fully supported by our marketing and communications work streams, where we talk to food companies around the importance of raising, their consumer awareness on animal welfare, taking their consumer on the journey with them through their, in-store marketing, whether it's on pack, whether it's through the magazine, whether it's TV advertising, and Philadelphia, I always talk about this one. It's one that's very close to my heart. I was integral into that decision, which was driven by their marketing team, and from the acknowledgement that few people would know that the milk that comes and goes into Philadelphia is actually now from pasture-reared cows with improvement plans for welfare. So that was all about brand loyalty. We also talk and put opinion pieces in trade pieces, talk to trade press, and our estimated consumer reach for last year was over 1.6 billion, which is actually great given our audience, and feeds into Compassion's overarching objectives on that. We also are supported heavily by our technical advice, and we produce key resources. Our fish ones are the latest, where we give the scientific case for our ask, or we give very practical advice on how to move to cage free or sow stall free for group housing of sows, free farrowing for pigs, and even some really lovely designs here around, we call them our Who Am I series. This is the laying hen. What do I think? What do I feel? Who am I? How can I lead a better life? How can I lead a good quality of life? Really engaging, and we have those across all our key species and across all fish. So we're very proud of our 2 billion animals set to benefit through awards, through our partnership programs, and through those pledges that we make. It is, unfortunately, a drop in the ocean. We have more than 80 billion animals now slaughtered for meat each year. It is still growing exponentially, probably another 10 billion every 7 to 10 years. The rise of veganism, vegetarian, flexitarian is fantastic, but it's doing nothing at this moment in time to reduce the number of animals that are in our system, largely in intensive systems. And the problem is that that's just unsustainable. It has a massive and unsustainable impact on our planet. And the difficulty that we face now is, this huge climate, nature and health crisis has literally crescendoed the time frame for incremental change around key issues like confinement, barren environments, mutilations, poor handling, poor slaughter. And it's just really bounced it onto the need for transformational shift, a completely new system, a radical change, if we are to deliver on our 2030 sustainability development goals, if we are to stay within that 1.5 planetary rise in temperature. We know our planetary boundaries are out. We see floods, we see fires, we see famine, we see, 1 million animals on the extinction list. And this is now with, a 1 degree rise in certain parts of countries. And this is all happening simultaneously. And there are solutions afoot. The planetary health diet from the Eat Lancet shows that we can feed 9–10 billion people on this planet sustainably if we reduce massively our meat and animal protein intake. So consumption is a major problem. We probably need to reduce our meat intake by at least 50%, if not 70% in high consuming countries. That for a meat eater is a horrible message. However, companies are on this. They are moving in the right direction. We're seeing a plethora of plant-based forward products in store. Great, but it's increasing footfall into these companies because it's producing wonderful choice for vegan and vegetarians who want to eat a sausage roll, a plant-based sausage roll, etc. But these foods are additive. They're also still processed. So they're, you can't live on processed foods. And despite, their sales expected to be around 1.1 billion, we have an awful lot more to do in this space. If we are to transform our food system, then we need not only to add great plant-based alternatives in, but we need to rebalance and reduce our meat consumption. And we need to make sure that all animals that are reared are in higher welfare systems. So we need to rebalance the food system, increase plant-based, reduce animal-based. We need to shift towards regenerative agriculture so that we can maintain soil health, we can, restore nature. And this needs a massive holistic approach within companies, joined up thinking across all their elements in sustainability. And it needs collective action at an international, multi-stakeholder level for leading food companies, leading NGOs and institutes, but also international governments as well. And, again, compassion is at the forefront of this through the work of Philip and, his books, his thought leadership work, our Extinction Programme, Extinction Conference in 2017. We were there in that space. It's taken, I think, 3 years for companies to get in that space, but they are. And we are working now on our Rethinking Food Programme, where we link intensive livestock production to the key pillars of sustainability, the people, planet, animals, around the buckets of health, food security, food safety, livelihoods, culture, around climate change, planetary boundaries, biodiversity loss, land use, water use, and around animal sentience, the impact on farm animals, the impact on wild animals, the impact on farmed fish and wild fish. And we have an approach which is business as usual for us. Build the business case, analyse the animal footprint and the gap analysis, give companies tools and frameworks that allow them to move forward in this space, require them to measure and report on progress, showcase the best practice and innovation, give them public recognition through our awards, and a new piece of work, ask them to sign up for a global agreement for sustainable food and farming. And this really helps companies move all the work that they're doing into one space, one overarching space that talks about health, livelihoods, regeneration, nature, around financial mechanisms to allow us to do this, and around higher animal welfare. And the last part of this year is us going out and talking to food companies in a positive way about this. I had my very first conversation yesterday, and I'm very pleased to say it went incredibly well, and will lead to further conversations and undoubtedly collaborative work in this space. From a food business perspective, we will be producing our awards. We will be looking at tools to encourage the rebalancing, not only on improving animal welfare, but the meat reduction, setting targets and responding on that, and actually giving public rankings on how well people are doing, as well as calculating that impact for the main foodstuffs. What's the impact on greenhouse gas emission, land use, water use, biodiversity? And if you reduce your protein by animal protein footprint by X, Y, and Z, what are the impacts on your sustainability? We have people in the team much cleverer than I, thank goodness, who are working on this at the moment and helping to drive it forward. So when I look at what's next for food business, for Compassion, I look at the next decade ahead, 2020 to 2030. It's a critical time for life on Earth, requiring systemic change of the global food and farming system. We are at a critical point to get this moving. Companies are in the right space to talk about this. Compassion is in the right space. Other institutes are in the right space. So in the next 3 years, we want to see demonstrable major shift from this incremental change towards regenerative, rebalancing food systems. In the coming year, that means that we drive the programme as hard as we can and our new work streams, and really shore up that institutional animal welfare into corporate policies so that we don't get any backsliding. That's done through our BB4, our business benchmark programme. We drive commitments, particularly on cage-free and chicken, and we establish our food, our Rethinking Food programme. If any of you saw the David Attenborough programme on Sunday, it's heartbreaking. This is really hard stuff to be involved in when you're always working on the negatives. We have to get to the solutions. We have to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And the photograph here does that for me and gives me inspiration that we can solve this. I will leave you with some testimonials from our food companies where, McDonald's, Woolworths South Africa, Pret say they value our expertise and insight and the fact that we continually challenge and push them. They value our pragmatic approach. And frankly, anybody who is truly serious about sustainability should work with us. Thank you very much. I hope that's given you an insight into what we do.
Huge thanks, Tracey. Thank you so much for a really inspiring vision of the future and what we need to do to bring the future to bear. A really important corporate conversation encompassing the need not only to reduce suffering of animals here and now, but also reduce meat and dairy and move towards a more regenerative food system. As you say, it's so important because time is running out. Humanity is facing increasing challenges heading into a climate, nature and pandemic emergency. All of the things are strongly linked to the way that we treat animals, to factory farming. Given the scale of those challenges, it's so important that we look for the very biggest levers for change. That's why a decade ago, we recognized the need to drive big picture policy change toward ending factory farming. Not just modifying it, but ending it completely. What we came to realize is that we need to strongly influence those who shape, make and fund policy in this area. Not only those inside governments, think tanks and companies who debate and decide on how things are going to be, but also those who have the power to change things through their investment dollars. So 10 years ago, we founded the Business Benchmark for Farm Animal Welfare, BB4, in partnership with the World Animal Protection and Collar Capital. Today, that benchmark has grown into the longest running and most global assessment of how food companies are dealing with farm animal welfare. Its role in framing the big change we need has been recognised, not least during the days of David Cameron as UK Prime Minister. Remember those days? I remember standing with the Prime Minister when one of his friends and former close advisors, Steve Hilton, launched a new book, More Human. In it, Hilton said we should ban factory farming. And in deciding how to ban it, he suggested that we look at the practices itemised in the Business Benchmark on farm animal welfare. So to tell us a little more about this groundbreaking benchmark, I'm pleased to welcome someone who is no stranger to the corporate world, having been head of corporate responsibility at the Body Shop for 15 years. She is also co-editor of this book, The Business of Farm Animal Welfare, and now heads up a coalition of companies working on farm animal welfare, including Unilever, Nestle, and IKEA. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce the Executive Director of BB4, Nicky Amos. Nicky, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you for the opportunity of being part of this event this evening. I just want to make sure I've got my slides showing. Please let me know when you can see them.
Slides are showing.
Okay, so over the next 10 minutes, I would like to talk you through how the Business Benchmark in Farm Animal Welfare, which is just in its 9th year this year, is driving both change in the way that companies and investors are managing animal welfare as a business risk and an investment risk and opportunity. So as Philip explained, the Business Benchmark was inspired by, sorry, I will just have to come back. I'm afraid this is a slight technical issue here. Right, bear with me. It was inspired by Compassion in World Farming and was launched by both Compassion in World Farming and World Animal Protection as a way of putting the issue of farm animal welfare on the business agenda. Animal welfare was underreported and was undermanaged as a corporate issue, and it wasn't even on the investor agenda at the time. So the Business Benchmark provided an accessible tool for companies as a management framework and for investors to engage with companies in their discussions in boardrooms to really ensure that animal welfare was on the business agenda. The Business Benchmark covers 150 of the major food companies across 3 industry subsectors: food retailers and wholesalers, food producers, and food service companies. And these companies, many of whom operate global operations and supply chains, are headquartered in 24 different countries. The programme is an annual benchmark. That's the most sort of iconic part of the overall programme. But the key to its success has been the engagement of investors, not just as passive supporters, but we have 32 institutional investors, including Schroders, Aviva, BNP Paribas, and others, who represent 2.3 trillion in assets under management signing the world's first global investor statement on farm animal welfare. Now, this sent a very strong signal when it was launched in 2015 to food companies that investors were putting animal welfare on their agenda and would be raising it in their engagements with company leadership teams. Alongside the investor statement, we have a global collaboration, and this involves the investors in our collaboration writing to the chief executive of every one of the 150 companies covered by the benchmark, commenting on their performance and asking for further information and explanation of the controls that companies have in place. So we recognised early on that improving the welfare of animals farmed for food is a collective responsibility, a responsibility that clearly extends to food companies and to their investors. The success of the benchmark can be, I think, partially attributed to the theory of change that we apply. So both companies and investors apply a similar logic to driving performance on sustainability issues. It's the same for climate change as it is for labour standards, as it should be for animal welfare. The logic follows that performance outcomes are fundamentally driven by a core set of beliefs and management commitments. These are typically outlined in a policy statement, which, when effectively implemented, for example, through management oversight, through training, through allocating resources and responsibilities for employees and for suppliers, will deliver the desired outcomes. And without these strong foundations, many corporate commitments simply remain empty promises. So the methodology, the construct of the benchmark is very much based on this theory of change. It's understanding how investors see company commitments and how they can deliver against them. And it's actually understanding how companies themselves make commitments and then deliver progress against them. So in working with World Animal Protection and Compassionate World Farming, we identified 35 evaluation criteria spread across 4 chapters, covering management commitment and policy, covering governance and management to ensure that there are effective controls in place for implementing, and for ensuring that companies were not just monitoring but also reporting on their performance against their policies and their commitments. We also added a chapter relating to leadership and innovation so that we could understand how companies were using their position in the global marketplace to drive change within the industry. So with a total score of 230, companies are ranked on their overall proportion of maximum score. At the bottom of our league table, we have tiers 5 and 6, where companies are showing little or no evidence that animal welfare is even on the business agenda, which is quite striking given the scale of the companies that are covered. The middle 2 tiers, tiers 3 and 4, are where we can see that companies are showing evidence of farm animal welfare being formalised by its management team and then implemented through its systems and processes. And then tiers 1 and 2 demonstrate companies that really are showing leadership on farm animal welfare and showing that animal welfare is integral to their business strategy. And this is just a quick snapshot of how the companies are arranged across the 6 tiers. So you'll see a number of companies, and this is on the business benchmark website, bb4.com, if you wanted to have a look. We further refine this ranking by providing a tier ranking by business sector. And this is really useful because it is able to see how they are performing relative to their peers, as can producers and as can restaurants and bars. And alongside awards, I would say that a ranking of a business in a benchmark is a very strong lever for corporate action. Nobody wants to be at the bottom of a benchmark, and in the main, companies do want to show incremental improvement when they know that they're going to be benchmarked year on year. And I thought it's worth sharing this slide because, you know, it's important to remember the scale of what Compassion is trying to achieve, as Tracey, very smartly outlined, and getting food companies to make farm animal welfare integral to their business agenda takes a long time. In our experience, it takes companies typically 2 or 3 years to acknowledge an issue and adopt a formal management position. Thereafter, it takes a further 2 or 3 years to develop and implement effective policies, systems, and processes for managing the issue, and ultimately for driving performance and delivering positive outcomes. This means that when companies are relatively new to the benchmark, and in 2018 we added 43 new companies to the benchmark, it will take some time before they have a formalised approach to animal welfare. And of course, this low performance of the new companies does skew the overall trend in the progress that we're seeing in the benchmark. So on this slide, the green graph shows that year on year, we were able to demonstrate incremental progress in the overall average scores of all companies covered by the benchmark. In 2018, when we moved from 99 companies to 150 companies, there were a few changes in ownership as well, then we saw the overall score drop. But encouragingly, we can see it starting to rise again. We feel that a more accurate portrait of the success of the benchmark can be found in looking at 55 companies that we refer to as trend companies. These are companies that have been continuously evaluated by the benchmark since 2012. And here we can show that the overall average score for these companies has grown from 25% in 2012 to 50% in 2019. And here's a summary of the trend companies. And what's really interesting is that 80% of these companies have moved up at least one tier since we started benchmarking them. A further 25% have moved up one tier, 33% have moved up 2 tiers, and then 12, who we affectionately call our disciples, have in fact moved up 3 tiers. And it may be surprising for you to see that some of the companies that you would expect to be leading on farm animal welfare, and in fact are in our benchmark, started from a relatively low base. So companies like Waitrose, for example, and Mitchells and Butlers and Nestle, these were appearing in lower tiers, tiers 4 and tiers 5 of the benchmark when we first began. So you can really see how seriously these companies are taking the benchmarking process. So let's have a look at a composite view of what's happening with the companies across the tiers. We have 22 companies who are really demonstrating their leadership. This is where animal welfare is integrated into their business processes and their strategies. And in 2019, we had 30 companies, that's 30, who moved up at least one tier in the benchmark since 2018. Some further highlights of the latest published benchmark is that 3/4 of companies now have published formal policies on farm animal welfare. So 75% compared to 41% in 2012. We have a similar proportion of companies that have set farm animal welfare related objectives and targets. Now, objectives and targets are important because it's the point at which companies will take their policies and turn them into action. And then we have 59% of companies who have explicit board or senior management oversight of farm animal welfare. They may have an animal welfare committee, or they may have a wider sustainability committee, a subcommittee of the board, if you like, that is explicitly looking at animal welfare alongside other sustainability issues. So we've got plenty of good news stories, but there is more work to be done. The business benchmark has always had as its objective to drive welfare standards in global supply chains. And in order for us to see whether or not we have been successful in achieving this mission, we require companies to report on the proportion of animals that are excluded from the worst forms of welfare in global food systems. So we want to know what proportion of total animals across all species, all geographies are free from close confinement. And the figures are looking quite positive here. 63% of companies are reporting on this indicator. We're also looking at the proportion of animals that are free from routine mutilations, the proportion of animals that are pre-slaughter stunned, and the proportion of animals that are transported, live transported, in 8 hours or less. But you can see that only 1 in 4 companies is actually reporting any data whatsoever. And the average score for companies in this section of the benchmark was just 15% of total scores. So what this tells us is that companies may have put a lot of effort into building their management systems approach and ensuring that they're properly resourced to drive animal welfare, but there is more work to be done before they can actually report complete and accurate data relating to the proportion of animals that are affected by their strategic commitments. So what do we want to do in the future? Well, I think there are probably 4 key areas. We want to and need to maintain momentum through the annual assessment of companies. We interestingly consulted companies this year during the COVID pandemic to ask whether or not we should defer the 2020 benchmark into next year. And they resoundingly said no. We've actually got real momentum here. We need to keep the momentum up within our companies and within our supply chain. And we don't want this to drop back down the business agenda. So keeping momentum is critical. We're also looking to work with companies, particularly those companies in the lower tier of the benchmark, that's 58 companies in tiers 5 and 6, who have yet to formalise their farm animal welfare approach. And we want to institutionalise farm animal welfare so that when there is a day when we're not benchmarking companies any longer, farm animal welfare will remain a core part of the business approach. We also want to continue to strengthen the signals being sent by investors to food companies about the importance of animal welfare as a business issue. And we'll continue to do that through webinars, through individual briefings, and through concerted efforts like our collaboration programme, where we are writing letters to CEOs on behalf of the investors. And then finally, we want to encourage leadership companies in the BB4 because we know that they inspire action and they lift the performance of their peers. So we are very encouraged by the progress that is being made, the way in which companies have responded to the annual benchmark process. But our job is not done yet. We still have considerable way to go before we feel that farm animal welfare and the risks and opportunities associated with it are being seriously managed by global food businesses. So I hope this has been of interest, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Nicky, thank you so much for that tour de force. And if anyone would like a deep dive into the issues and the interplays, that book again, The Business of Farm Animal Welfare, published by Routledge, and it's bang up to date and fantastic case studies, including farmed fish and the use of antibiotics in farming and why that should stop on a routine basis. Nicky, thank you so much for your excellent presentation, and for Tracey before you. And let's bring back Tracey, and we've got a few questions. We've got some time for questions. Tracey, welcome back. And the first question, really, actually, if I can address it to you, Tracey, is that in the light of COVID-19, how important is it that Compassion broadens our message to food companies and encourages them to advocate less and better meat, perhaps to stop the next pandemic?
It's absolutely critical, Philip, that we forge ahead now on this path of rethinking food and meat reduction. The time, frankly, is right. Coming out of this COVID crisis, where people have been thinking of the climate change issues, the health emergency, the nature emergency, companies are really in the mindset. They've been working hard. They need to do more joined up thinking. They need to move from just adding to replacing and getting some meat reduction targets on the agenda. I really feel that that time is coming. And finally, we really need to stop factory farming version 2.0. This is on our doorstep. It is frightening. We are getting rid of cages in some regions and we are putting cages in others, not only for laying hens, but for broiler chickens, but for turkeys. There are multi-story, massive complexes going up for pigs. Risk to pandemic, it sits there. They're not learning and we have to stop that.
Absolutely, Tracey, thank you. Factory farming being a perfect breeding ground for new and more deadly viruses, of course, and thereby the next pandemic. Nicky, how is this playing out in the corporate rooms that you're privy to? And are corporations taking this message on that they need to start grappling with the amount of meat that we're all eating? How's that playing out?
Yeah, they are. I believe they are, Philip. I mean, I think that there are certainly lots of aspirations. There are companies making commitments and investments into alternative forms of food protein. But we also have to recognise that a lot of companies are still heavily invested in livestock farming systems, which is why the work of the benchmark is still essential in ensuring that companies remain accountable for the lives of those animals that are in existing established systems. Over time, of course, the aim will be to help move them, transition them away from these intensive systems into more extensive systems. And I think with having the investor community much more attuned and aligned to what good welfare looks like in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago, before the benchmark was established, I think that's also going to help those discussions and some of those decisions about investments in new forms of animal production.
Thank you, Nicky. That's really encouraging to hear. And yeah, I think one of the big worries that I have, that many people have, is that, of course, COVID has plunged us into financial difficulty globally, into a recession, and many people are perhaps questioning whether they can afford higher welfare food. And the question is, will this mean, Tracey, that Compassion is only going to be focusing on high-end brands and retailers like Waitrose? Is the mass movement slipping away from us in the light of the economic difficulty?
Well, undoubtedly, affordability of food is top of mind for all our corporate partners, and they are looking at mitigation strategies to cope with that. But I think the really reassuring thing for me is that we've seen a few trials on higher welfare chicken hit the shelves, and we're seeing consumers trade up, not trade down. So that's a really positive sign. And we're seeing companies continue to report and doing better on their higher welfare commitments. So the message we're getting from our companies, they're still committed to the higher welfare. They will still drive its progress. Affordability is top of mind, but it means that they have to change the business model to adapt. So I think really positive signs coming out from the industry, which means that we will continue to raise baseline standards in the big companies.
So essentially, you get what you pay for. Companies are still committed, and people are understanding in these COVID-related times that the better meat and dairy, less of it, can lead to a healthier diet for themselves and their families. And Nicky, are you noticing a shift within the companies that you're working with? Is it an attitudinal shift that they're picking up on, that they're running with?
Yeah, I absolutely can see that. I mean, what is really encouraging is that higher welfare is being promoted by companies across the value chain and across the price points as well of the marketplace. So, when you can see Aldi and Lidl and Kaufland and others you know, who have very, very sensitive price points for their consumers, able to provide higher welfare alternatives or choices. That's really encouraging, because it demonstrates that it isn't, you know, just about the niche brands being able to afford higher welfare. There are some really smart actions that companies can take. And I think, you know, companies are realizing, and COVID's highlighted this, is that, you know, they all have a responsibility to work collaboratively to build a more resilient, fair and healthy food system for the future.
Yeah. And I think it's great that companies are embracing this message that that, you know, the way forward to building a more resilient future is through less and better meat, more plants, less meat and dairy, ensuring that it comes from pasture-fed, free-range and organic. That's certainly the message from Compassion in World Farming. And Tracey, you'll be beating that drum ever louder. And has the pandemic actually provided you with greater leverage? And how are companies receiving your messages these days? Has it been an opportunity to talk differently to companies?
Very much so. I think the crisis has really, you know, as I said earlier, you know, really butted up that incremental change to transformative change, and companies are getting their heads around this and are, you know, looking for solutions and are really ripe for those conversations. So I think it's provided a perfect opportunity for us. As I said earlier, I think it took 3 years from the Extinction Conference for us to get here with companies and a pandemic in the meantime. But we definitely need to be on the case now with those conversations. Absolutely.
And these wider issues really are becoming more sharply in focus as to how they relate to farm and animal welfare. And Nicky, your benchmark tracks the use of antibiotics in the system. 73% of the world's antibiotics fed to farmed animals, which is a big driver of antibiotic resistance and potentially a post antibiotic era where currently treatable diseases could once again kill. Factory farming is taking us there. Tell us about what was the decision-making process behind including that in the benchmark and monitoring how companies are doing.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a very real and frightening statistics that you've shared, and you know, we all can see the consequences of that. Firstly, of course, antibiotics per se are not a welfare issue. They play an important role in maintaining human as well as animal health in livestock systems. But we are also very aware that antibiotics are used prophylactically. So they're used routinely. They are administered to animals on a daily basis to prop up poor welfare conditions. So, you know, when animals are in cramped housing, then they are fed antibiotics to reduce the risk of disease, which is why we are keen to track the number of companies that are making commitments to eliminate or at least significantly reduce the proportion of antibiotics that are routinely administered.
Nicky, thanks for all that you're doing to bring into the light what's happening in corporate land, and to track and monitor and make it publicly available. And I think the big game changer is getting the investor community behind the work that you're doing, so that companies, 150 companies, as I understand it globally, are now being benchmarked and are under the investor scrutiny, amounting to more than $2 trillion under asset. Which is fantastic. Tracey, we're short of time, so really the last question to you, which is, how can people support your work? You know, we need to be louder, we need to be clearer, we need to be further and wider in our messaging that factory farming in all its forms needs to end, and that the corporate planet Earth needs to play a big leadership role in that. How can people support the work that you're doing?
Yeah, and I think that In our daily lives, we can support the work through, you know, our consumer choices and purchasing choices, whether that's high welfare or plant forward choices, through our discussions with our friends and family and colleagues, you know, promoting the work of compassion and of, you know, connecting the dots around sustainable food production. And of course, you know, people continue to support our programs, which I find hugely humbling and, you know, incredibly grateful for, that people have faith in us to help drive this forward. So their continued support is most grateful received. Yeah.
Tracey, thank you. And Nicky, thank you so much for joining us this evening from the business benchmark on farm animal welfare. Tracey, thank you so much for mapping out your future plans to bring big picture impact at scale through corporate engagement. And I'd like to thank all of you, our fantastic supporters, for continuing to share in our journey and be a major part in ensuring that our work can happen, that you can continue to play a part in it, because without you, frankly, we can't do what we do. You know, we are at a tipping point where farmed animal welfare is recognised as an issue of importance. The connectivity with wildlife, the kind of things that Sir David Attenborough was talking about at the weekend, the extinction of wildlife, are becoming ever clearer. The fact that factory farming is the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet. It is also a major driver of wildlife declines, and it is a big risk factor recognised by the European Union of pandemics of the future. Our future and those of farmed animals and wildlife are so interconnected. Bringing corporate leverage to bear for a better future is in all our interests. Thank you so much for being part of that change. Thank you so much for reducing vast swathes of suffering across the planet. 2 billion animals better off every year, living better lives, thanks to the work that you have all helped ensure happens. Let's move on to the next 2 billion, no, 20 billion, 80 billion. Let's end factory farming. Let's create that better future for us all. Thank you so much and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.